Before sunrise on the final day at Thermopylae, King Leonidas learned that Persian soldiers were descending from the mountain behind him. The narrow pass that had protected the Greek army was about to become a trap. For 2 days, the defenders had faced the largest invasion force their world had ever seen. Mountains rose on one side of them. The sea lay on the other. Between those two boundaries, a few thousand Greeks had made numbers matter less. Now the hidden road around the pass had been revealed. The news arrived in fragments. A seer-read disaster in the morning sacrifice. Men who had escaped from the Persian column came through the darkness with the same warning. Then the guards from the mountain path appeared at dawn. The Persians were coming from behind. Most of the Greek army would soon leave the pass. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans would remain. 700 men from the small city of Thespians would remain with them by choice. A group of the bands would also be present, though their reasons and loyalties would later become a matter of dispute. By the end of the day, Leonidas would be dead. So would almost every man who stayed beside him. Yet their defeat would be remembered for more than 2,000 years. It would become a story of courage, obedience, sacrifice, and freedom. It would also become a legend so powerful that the thousands of other Greeks at Thermopylae nearly disappeared behind the number 300. Tonight, we return to the hot gates. Not to the world of monsters and impossible warriors, but to a narrow strip of ground in the late summer of 480 before the Common Era. We will follow the king who held it, the allies history often forgets, and the Persian ruler whose army had crossed continents to reach him. The central question is not whether Leonidas survived. His death is known from the beginning. The question is why he remained when the road south was still open, and why other men chose to remain beside him. To understand that final morning, we must first travel east, far beyond the Greek mainland, to an empire whose roads connected the Aegean Sea with Egypt, Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and the edge of India. There, a new king inherited an old war. His name was Xerxes. Xerxes did not rule a single people or a single landscape. He ruled an empire. The Achaemenid Persian Empire had been built by generations of kings. Cyrus the Great had expanded Persian power across much of Western Asia. Cambyses had conquered Egypt. Darius I had strengthened administration, taxation, roads, and royal authority across a territory larger than any state the Greek world had known. Within that empire lived Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, Lydians, Phoenicians, Jews, Greeks, and many other peoples. They spoke different languages, honored different gods, wore different clothing, and fought in different ways. Local rulers and communities could retain many of their own customs so long as they accepted the authority of the great king and provided tribute, labor, or military service when required. To imagine this world only as a dark army moving west is to misunderstand its scale. The Persian court governed through officials, messengers, roads, storehouses, ports, and negotiated loyalties. Royal commands could travel across immense distances. Supplies could be gathered long before an army arrived. Ships came from maritime peoples who had served the empire for years. Soldiers came from regions that many Greeks knew only through travelers' stories. The conflict with mainland Greece began along the empire's western edge. Greek-speaking cities had existed for centuries on the coast of Asia Minor. By the late 6th century before the Common Era, many had come under Persian rule. In 499, several of those cities rebelled in what became known as the Ionian Revolt. Athens and the small city of Eretria sent ships to support them. The assistance was limited, and the revolt was eventually defeated. But the involvement of mainland Greeks gave Darius a reason to carry Persian power across the Aegean. It was not the only reason. Empires tend to secure borders, punish resistance, and expand where expansion appears possible. Yet in the Greek tradition, the burning of Sardis and the defiance of Athens became personal injuries remembered by a king. A Persian expedition crossed the Aegean in 490. It captured Eretria and landed on the plain of Marathon, not far from Athens. There, an Athenian army supported by Plataea defeated the invaders. The victory did not destroy Persian power. It did, however, prove that a Persian force could be beaten on Greek soil. Darius began preparing another campaign. He died before he could lead it. The throne passed to Xerxes, his son by Atossa, a daughter of Cyrus the Great. Before turning west, Xerxes secured his rule and responded to revolt in Egypt. Then the preparations for Greece continued on a scale that made the earlier expedition look small. The new campaign would not depend on a single fleet crossing open water. It would move by land and sea together. The preparations took years. Food and equipment were gathered along the route. Depots were established. Roads were cleared. Rivers and coastlines were studied. At the narrow Hellespont, where Asia and Europe almost touch, engineers built bridges from ships so that the army could cross the water on foot. Farther west, workers cut a channel through the neck of the Mount Athos Peninsula. A Persian fleet had suffered disaster there during an earlier campaign when a storm drove ships against the coast. Xerxes would not ask the new armada to risk the same passage. The canal was an extraordinary statement of planning and royal power. It also showed that the invasion was expected to move as one enormous system, with army and navy supporting each other along the northern Aegean. Herodotus, the Greek historian who gives us the fullest surviving account, describes the expedition with deliberate wonder. He wrote decades after the battle. His work preserves valuable information, local traditions, remembered names, speeches, rumors, and stories shaped by later understanding. It is indispensable, but it is not a modern military report. Herodotus counted the Persian forces in the millions. Those numbers cannot be accepted literally. An army of that size could not have moved, camped, and eaten along the route he describes. Modern estimates vary widely, and no exact figure can be recovered. What can be said with confidence is that Xerxes commanded a force vastly larger than anything the divided Greek cities could place at one location. It may have numbered well into the tens of thousands and perhaps beyond 100,000 when soldiers, sailors, and support personnel are considered. The fleet contained hundreds of warships and an even larger number of transport vessels. For the people watching it pass, exact arithmetic mattered less than the visible scale. Columns of infantry stretched along roads. Horses, pack animals, wagons, servants, engineers, cooks, merchants, and camp followers moved with them. Different units carried wicker shields, spears, bows, axes, short swords, or long cavalry weapons. Clothing and armor changed from one contingent to the next. This was not a uniform mass. It was an imperial army assembled from many regions and held together by command, logistics, and the authority of the king. Herodotus also gives the campaign a dramatic personality through Xerxes himself. When a storm destroyed the first bridges across the Hellespont, the historian says that the king ordered the water punished and the engineers executed. New bridges were built. The army crossed beneath burning incense while the king watched from a high seat. The story may preserve royal anger, Greek moral storytelling, or both. In Herodotus, rulers who attempt to command nature invite the reader to consider the limits of human power. But the bridges did work. The army entered Europe. Whatever later generations thought of Xerxes, his expedition was not a fantasy of pride. It was a real achievement of organization, and it carried real danger toward Greece. As the invasion moved through Thrace and Macedonia, many communities submitted. The symbolic demand was simple: earth and water. To offer them was to acknowledge Persian authority. Some Greek cities had already chosen that path. Others remained neutral, waited to see which side would prevail, or feared their neighbors as much as they feared the great king. There was no single Greek nation waiting in unity. The Greek world was divided among hundreds of communities. Athens and Sparta had different governments, different military strengths, and a long history of suspicion. Smaller cities guarded their independence. Old rivalries did not disappear because a foreign army had crossed into Europe. The alliance that formed against Xerxes was therefore fragile from the beginning. Representatives met, exchanged oaths, and argued over command. Sparta, respected for its army, received leadership on land. The Athenian fleet formed the largest part of the naval force, but Athens accepted a Spartan commander at sea in order to preserve cooperation. The strategist most closely associated with the naval plan was the Athenian Themistocles. He understood that the invasion could not be stopped by land battle alone. Xerxes' army depended on the fleet for supply and movement along the coast. If the Persian ships sailed freely into central and southern Greece, no narrow land position would remain secure for long. The first Greek attempt to block the advance was made at the Vale of Tempe in Thessaly. A force marched north, inspected the ground, and withdrew. The position could be bypassed through other routes, and the approaching army was too large to risk being trapped there. The next plan linked two places. The army would hold the pass at Thermopylae. The fleet would hold the waters near Artemisium. Each position protected the other. The ships at Artemisium could prevent the Persian navy from sailing behind the defenders at Thermopylae. The army at the pass could stop Persian troops from moving south and threatening the fleet's bases from land. The plan did not promise an immediate victory. It promised delay, damage, and time. For Xerxes, the road south passed between mountain and sea. For the Greeks, the challenge was to place enough men in that narrow space before fear and disagreement dissolved the alliance. Sparta was expected to lead. Yet when the moment arrived, the main Spartan army did not march north. A religious festival called the Carneia was underway, and the Olympic Games were also being celebrated. Ancient warfare did not exist outside religion, calendars, and civic obligation. The Spartans intended to send their full force later. For the present, they sent a king and 300 chosen citizens ahead. The king was Leonidas. Leonidas had not grown up expecting to become king. Sparta had 2 royal houses and 2 kings at the same time. The arrangement was ancient, complicated, and designed to prevent too much authority from resting in one family. Kings led armies, performed important religious duties, and held prestige, but they did not rule without councils, magistrates, and law. Leonidas belonged to the Agiad royal line. His father was King Anaxandridas. 2 older brothers stood before him in the succession. Cleomenes became king. Dorius, ambitious and confident, left Sparta and eventually died during an expedition in Sicily. When Cleomenes died without a surviving son, Leonidas inherited the kingship unexpectedly. He was probably already a mature man. Unlike a prince raised as the certain heir, he had passed through the Spartan educational system with other citizen boys. That experience would later make him appear unusually close to the men he commanded, though the details of his early life are largely lost. Leonidas married Gorgo, the daughter of Cleomenes. Herodotus remembers Gorgo as intelligent and direct. In one story, when she was still a child, she warned her father that a visitor was trying to corrupt him with a bribe. In another, she understood how to reveal a secret message hidden beneath the wax of a writing tablet. We should be cautious with scenes preserved as memorable anecdotes. Yet the tradition surrounding Gorgo suggests that later Greeks did not imagine the Spartan queen as a silent figure in the background. Leonidas and Gorgo had a son named Pleistachus. That detail matters because Herodotus says Leonidas selected his 300 from men who already had living sons. The reason is not stated directly. The choice may have ensured that each household would retain an heir if the expedition ended in death. It may also have marked the men as established citizens with families and reputations already rooted in Sparta. The number 300 was not the entire Spartan military strength. It was a chosen royal force, an advance contingent sent while the larger army remained behind. Each full Spartan citizen was part of a society built around military readiness, but that society depended on many people who did not share full citizenship. The Helots, an unfree population bound to the land, produced much of the food that allowed Spartan citizens to train and serve as soldiers. The Perioikoi, free communities without Spartan political rights, worked as farmers, craftsmen, traders, and soldiers. Women managed households and property during the long absences of men. Spartan discipline was real. So was the coercion beneath it. A truthful account cannot praise the courage of Leonidas while pretending that Sparta was a simple society of equal warriors. Its famous citizen army stood at the top of a harsh social order maintained by force and fear. Leonidas was both a product and a leader of that world. The Spartans trained to fight together rather than as isolated heroes. A hoplite carried a large round shield, a spear, and a short sword. Bronze protected the head and parts of the body, though equipment varied and changed over time. The shield was heavy enough to shape the entire formation. It protected the man who carried it and part of the man beside him. Success depended on keeping position. The ideal was not wild aggression. It was control under pressure. Men had to move in rhythm, hold the line when bodies pushed against them, and trust that the shield to the right would remain where it belonged. Spartan education reinforced obedience, endurance, and the fear of public shame. Songs, communal meals, age groups, and constant judgment connected military behavior to civic identity. A citizen who abandoned his place endangered more than himself. He threatened the formation and returned home beneath the eyes of people who knew exactly what had happened. This helps explain Leonidas, but it does not make his final choice automatic. Spartan armies withdrew when commanders believed withdrawal was necessary. They negotiated, delayed, and adapted like other armies. The men at Thermopylae were not machines controlled by a code. They were human beings making decisions inside a powerful culture of duty. One more element shaped the story. Herodotus says the Spartans had asked the oracle at Delphi what the war would bring. The answer offered two possibilities. Either the city of Sparta would be destroyed, or a Spartan king descended from Heracles would die. We cannot know exactly when the oracle took this form or how Leonidas understood it. Prophecies in Greek historical writing often become clear only after the event. They organize memory by making catastrophe appear both foretold and meaningful. Yet the oracle belonged to the way later Greeks explained why a king remained at the pass. Leonidas may have left Sparta knowing that the expedition was dangerous. He could not have known every detail of the death later imagined for him. He expected reinforcements. The 300 were sent as an advance force, not as actors in a planned funeral. Still, the men marched north during a moment when much of Greece was uncertain whether resistance could succeed. Their presence was a message. Sparta had not submitted. Along the road, other contingents joined Leonidas. Arcadians came from Tegea, Mantinea, Orchomenus, and smaller communities. Corinthians, Phlians, Mycenaeans, Thespians, and the bands joined them. Locrians and Phocians would defend their own nearby land. The total force at Thermopylae was not 300. It was probably around 6,000 or 7,000 fighting men at the beginning, perhaps more when attendants and others not clearly counted in the surviving sources are included. The 300 Spartans were the most famous part of the army. They were never the whole of it. Together, the Greeks continued toward a place whose name meant the Hot Gates. Thermopylae looked different in 480 before the Common Era than it does today. Over centuries, rivers have carried silt toward the sea and widened the coastal plain. In the time of Leonidas, the shoreline lay much closer to the mountain. The road south narrowed between steep ground and the water, sometimes to a space where only a small number of men could move side by side. Warm mineral springs rose near the pass. Steam drifted above the water. The smell of sulfur hung in the air. Travelers had used the route for generations, passing through gates created by geography rather than stone. There were 3 especially narrow points. The central gate became the main Greek position. A wall built earlier by the Phocians crossed the pass there. It had fallen into disrepair, so the defenders rebuilt it with whatever material they could gather. The wall gave shape to the camp. On the side facing the Persian approach, units could rotate into the narrow fighting space. Behind it, men rested, repaired equipment, prepared food, and waited for their turn. The sea limited movement on one flank. The mountain limited it on the other. A large army could reach Thermopylae. It could not use all its strength at once. That was the purpose of the position. The defenders also knew that the mountain was not completely sealed. A path called the Anapia climbed through wooded ground and eventually descended behind the pass. Local people knew it. The Phocians, whose homeland lay nearby, were assigned to guard it. The plan therefore depended on more than the wall. It depended on the fleet at Artemisium, the guards on the mountain, the willingness of allied cities to send help, and the ability of several thousand men to remain united under pressure. At first, unity was uncertain. When news arrived that Xerxes was near, some Peloponnesian commanders wanted to withdraw south and defend the Isthmus of Corinth. From their perspective, the isthmus protected the entrance to their own peninsula and offered a position closer to home. The Locrians and Phocians objected. Abandoning Thermopylae would expose central Greece immediately. Their towns, fields, temples, and families lay north of the isthmus. An alliance that defended only the Peloponnese would ask them to sacrifice everything for cities that had retreated behind them. Leonidas argued for remaining. Messengers could be sent for reinforcements. The position had not yet been tested. The invader, however enormous, was still human. The decision kept the alliance together for the moment. South of the camp, roads remained open. Ships moved in the nearby waters. Men could still imagine that larger Greek forces would arrive once festivals ended and cities understood the urgency. Then the Persian army entered the plain north of the pass. The arrival could not have been hidden. Dust rose above the roads. Campfires multiplied across the landscape. Tents, animals, wagons, weapons, and unfamiliar standards filled the ground beyond the Greek position. Xerxes had reached the first narrow gate into central Greece. The king did not attack immediately. Herodotus says he waited for days, expecting the defenders to lose courage and leave. The delay may also have allowed units and supplies to gather after the long march. Whatever the reason, the waiting became part of the battle. For the Greeks, every quiet day carried 2 meanings. It gave reinforcements more time to arrive. It also gave the Persian army more time to surround them with the visible evidence of its size. Xerxes sent a mounted scout toward the wall. The rider was allowed to approach. No one chased him. He could not see the entire Greek force, because many men were behind the repaired wall, but he saw Spartans stationed outside it. Some were exercising. Others were combing their long hair. The scout returned and reported what he had seen. Xerxes found the behavior difficult to understand. Men facing an overwhelming army should have looked frightened, hurried, or desperate. These men appeared calm enough to prepare themselves with care. A former Spartan king named Immortals was present in Xerxes' court. Years earlier, political conflict had driven him from Sparta. He had taken refuge with Darius and later accompanied Xerxes. He knew the people waiting at the pass and understood the meaning of the scout's report. According to Herodotus, Immortals explained that Spartans arranged their hair before risking their lives. Their calm was not proof that they expected peace. It was proof that they expected battle. The exchange between Xerxes and Immortals is shaped like a lesson. The great king sees only a small number of men. The exile sees a society governed by law and shame. Herodotus uses their conversation to contrast different forms of obedience. We should not turn that contrast into a simple division between free Greeks and enslaved Persians. Many people in the Persian army fought from loyalty, status, duty, community, or ambition. Many Greek communities had submitted to Persia. Sparta itself denied freedom to the Helots on whom its citizen army depended. History at Thermopylae is more complicated than the legend that grew from it. Still, the scout had discovered something important. The defenders had not fled. Behind the wall, thousands of men from many cities waited with them. Fires burned beneath cooking vessels. Shields leaned against stone. Spears were inspected. The sound of the sea continued beside the road. On the 5th day, Xerxes ordered the first attack. Before the fighting began, the camp at Thermopylae was a temporary city of soldiers. The men did not all speak in the same dialect. They did not all wear identical armor. Some had served together before. Others came from communities more accustomed to rivalry than cooperation. The Arcadians formed a large part of the force. Corinthians and men from smaller Peloponnesian cities stood beside them. The Locrians and Phocians defended the road into their own region. The Thespians came from Boeotia, where some cities were already suspected of favoring Persia. The 400 Thespians occupied the most uncertain place in later memory. Herodotus believed Leonidas brought them partly as hostages because Thebes was accused of planning to submit. He later says they remained for the final battle unwillingly and surrendered when they could. Other evidence suggests the political situation in Thebes was divided, and it is possible that the men at Thermopylae represented an anti-Persian group whose choices were more complicated than Herodotus allowed. The uncertainty matters. Victorious communities often simplify the loyalties of the past. Those who resist become pure. Those who submit become cowards. Real cities contain factions, families, fears, and changing calculations. The Spartans themselves did not stand at the pass without support. Helots almost certainly accompanied the citizen soldiers as attendants and laborers. They carried equipment, prepared food, cared for animals, and performed tasks that made hoplite warfare possible. Some may have fought during the final struggle. The surviving sources do not let us count them with confidence. Their near disappearance from the famous story is part of the way Spartan memory worked. The 300 are presented as a self-contained brotherhood. In reality, their society and their expedition depended on people denied the honor later given to them. Leonidas commanded the allied army, but each contingent retained its own officers and identity. He could persuade and coordinate. He could not erase the interests of every city. That made the waiting dangerous. If one group withdrew, others might follow. If the Persian army found a route around the wall, the entire position could collapse. If the fleet at Artemisium failed, enemy ships might appear behind them. The defenders therefore lived between confidence and uncertainty. They knew why the pass was strong. They did not know how long every part of the plan would hold. Among the Spartans was a man named Dionysus. Herodotus later called him the bravest of the 300 and preserved a remark associated with him. A local man warned that Persian archers were so numerous that their arrows could hide the sun. Dionysius answered that this was good news. They would fight in the shade. The line may have been polished by retelling. Yet it captures the kind of courage admired in Spartan culture. Fear answered not with a speech, but with a brief refusal to grant the threat its intended power. Not every story from Thermopylae can be verified. Later writers attached famous commands to Leonidas. Persian envoys supposedly demanded that the Greeks surrender their weapons. Leonidas answered with 2 words often translated as "come and take them." The reply belongs to ancient tradition, but it does not appear in Herodotus' account of the battle. It is preserved by Plutarch, writing centuries later. That does not make the phrase meaningless. It shows how later generations wanted Leonidas to sound controlled, economical, and completely unwilling to negotiate. The historical king probably spoke many more words during the days at the pass. He had to hear reports, settle disagreements, assign units, inspect the wall, communicate with the fleet, and decide when to rotate men into danger. His leadership was practical before it became legendary. The first Persian troops sent against the position were Medes and Scythians, according to Herodotus. Xerxes ordered them to capture the defenders and bring them before him. The command reflects the confidence of an army that had crossed every barrier placed before it. The attackers entered the narrow ground near the wall. Behind them waited more men than could see the front. Ahead stood heavy infantry whose shields overlapped across the pass. The advantage of numbers narrowed with the road. Persian infantry was not weak or untrained. Its forces had conquered kingdoms and defeated many different enemies. But the units sent first at Thermopylae were required to fight on ground chosen by defenders equipped for close combat. Many Persian soldiers carried lighter shields and shorter spears than the Greek hoplites. Archery could disrupt an exposed army, but arrows were less decisive against a dense formation protected by large shields and constrained by stone, mountain, and wall. The Greeks did not need to defeat the entire invasion force. They needed to hold the few meters in front of them. When one contingent tired, another could replace it. Men behind the line passed water, carried the wounded, and prepared to move forward. Commands traveled through noise, dust, and the pressure of bodies. Leonidas had spent days waiting for the army to attack the place he had chosen. Now the battle entered the pass. The calm images seen by the Persian scout disappeared beneath the sound of shields, spear shafts, feet against stone, and men calling to one another through the narrow gate. The first assault lasted for hours. The Persian commanders could replace losses, but replacement did not solve the central problem. Every new unit entered the same confined ground. Men at the rear pushed toward a struggle they could barely see. Those at the front had little room to avoid the points of longer Greek spears. The hoplite shield was designed for collective pressure. Held on the left arm, it covered much of the body and extended toward the neighbor. A line of such shields could become a moving barrier. Behind it, spears reached forward over or between the rims. No formation remained perfect for an entire day. Men slipped. Spears broke. Shields shifted. Wounded soldiers had to be drawn back or stepped around. The ground itself changed as equipment and bodies accumulated in the narrow space. Yet the defenders maintained enough order to prevent a breakthrough. Herodotus says the Spartans used a dangerous trick. At moments they turned and appeared to flee. The Persians pursued with shouts, believing the line had finally broken. Then the Spartans turned together and struck the pursuers after their formation had stretched and lost order. The maneuver may have been remembered with admiration because it required extraordinary control. A false retreat can become a real one in seconds. Men must know when to stop, trust that others will stop with them, and turn before the enemy reaches their backs. Whether every detail occurred exactly as described, the story reveals how the battle was understood. The Greeks were not merely standing still. They used the pass, rotation, reach, and discipline to make the Persian advantage difficult to apply. Xerxes watched from a position where he could see the struggle. Herodotus says the king rose from his seat 3 times in fear for his army. The image may be dramatic, but Persian losses were clearly serious enough to force a change. The Medes and Scythians withdrew. The road remained closed. For the defenders, success brought relief but not safety. They could see new formations preparing beyond the fighting ground. The great king had not crossed Europe with only 1 line of infantry. The next troops sent forward were the Persian elite commanded by Hydarnes. Greek sources called them the Immortals. Herodotus explains the name by saying the unit was always kept at 10,000 men. Whenever one soldier died or became ill, another replaced him, preserving the number. The exact Persian name and organization remain uncertain. What matters is that these were trusted troops expected to succeed where the first assault had failed. They advanced toward the repaired wall as daylight began to soften. The Immortals entered the same narrow ground. Their status changed the expectations around them, but it did not change the width of the pass. Hydarnes commanded experienced soldiers. They carried fine equipment and belonged close to the center of royal power. In open country, supported by archers and cavalry, they formed part of a flexible imperial army. At Thermopylae, cavalry could not break the shield wall. Large formations could not spread across the flanks. Missiles passed over a battlefield crowded with Persian troops as well as Greeks. The fight became close again. The longer Greek spears reached beyond shorter weapons. Heavy shields absorbed blows. Units from different Greek cities rotated through the line. The Spartans became the center of later memory, but the position was held by an allied army. Men from communities that often distrusted one another now depended on the same wall. By the end of the first day, the Persian attacks had failed. The defenders still held Thermopylae. There was no celebration large enough to erase the reality waiting north of them. The Persian camp remained immense. Fires appeared again across the plain. New troops could attack in the morning. The Greeks countered losses, repaired spear shafts where possible, tightened shield fittings, and carried wounded men away from the wall. Night changed the pass. The mountain became a dark mass above the camp. The sea could be heard more clearly when the shouting ended. Steam continued to rise from the hot springs. Small lamps moved among the shelters as men searched for companions. Leonidas had won the first day. He had not solved the larger problem. Reinforcements had not arrived. The Persian fleet still faced the Greek ships near Artemisium. The mountain path remained guarded, but every local road was a source of danger if someone chose to guide the enemy. In the Persian camp, commanders had learned that a frontal assault would be expensive. Xerxes could continue to spend lives against the wall. He could also search for another way. For the moment, he chose to attack again. The second day would test whether the first had been an accident, and whether the defenders could repeat their discipline after fatigue, wounds, and the knowledge of what close battle felt like. Before dawn, men on both sides prepared to return to the same narrow ground. The second day began with another Persian assault. Xerxes expected the Greeks to be weakened. The defenders had spent the previous day under constant pressure. Their wounded reduced the number available. Their weapons had been used against shields, armor, bone, and stone. Yet fatigue did not create the opening he needed. The Greek line held. Herodotus gives fewer details for the second day than for the first. That silence may reflect repetition. The same narrow ground produced the same problem. Persian units advanced, suffered, withdrew, and were replaced. Greek contingents moved forward and back through the gate. To the men fighting, however, no hour would have felt repetitive. Every approach brought different faces. Every broken spear altered the way a man defended himself. Every gap in the line had to be closed before the enemy saw it. The defenders could not know how the battle looked from a distance. They knew the weight of their shields, the heat beneath helmets, the taste of dust, and the small section of road visible in front of them. They knew whether the man beside them was still standing. For Leonidas, command meant thinking beyond that immediate space. He had to preserve enough strength for another attack. He had to prevent one city from bearing all the losses. He had to judge when apparent success tempted men too far from the wall. He also had to watch for news from beyond the battlefield. The fleet at Artemisium was fighting at nearly the same time. Storms had already damaged Persian ships along the coast, but the naval balance remained dangerous. Messages between army and fleet could take hours, and information arrived incomplete. The entire Greek defense rested on linked uncertainties. By late in the second day, the Persian army still had not forced the pass. The result was a tactical success for Leonidas. It was also a warning to Xerxes that the cost of continuing in the same way would remain high. The great king possessed more than soldiers. He possessed money, intelligence networks, local allies, exiles, guides, and the ability to reward information. Somewhere near Thermopylae lived a man named Ephialtes. Herodotus identifies him as a local from Marlis. Later tradition made his name a word for nightmare and betrayal. Ephialtes knew the path over the mountain. He went to Xerxes and offered to reveal it in return for a reward. The decision changed the battle more completely than any frontal attack. The story of betrayal has always been central to Thermopylae. It gives the defeat a human cause. The pass did not fail because the defenders lacked courage. It failed because someone opened a road around them. Herodotus considered other possible informants, but concluded that Ephialtes was responsible. A reward was later offered for his death. He was eventually killed for an unrelated reason, and the man who killed him received honor when the older accusation became known. We know almost nothing about Ephialtes beyond the act attached to his name. Later imagination made him physically deformed, bitter, and rejected by Leonidas. There is no historical evidence for that portrait. The ancient account presents a local man motivated by the hope of payment. That ordinary motive is more unsettling than a monster. Great plans can be undone by someone who knows a road and believes knowledge can be sold. Xerxes placed the mission under Hydaspes, commander of the Immortals. After sunset, the Persian column left the main camp. Ephialtes guided them toward the mountain path. The route climbed away from the sea beneath oak-covered slopes. The men carried weapons in darkness. Thousands of feet pressed leaves and branches into the ground. No moonlit procession would have been silent, but distance and forest concealed the sound from the main Greek camp below. The Phocians guarding the route had chosen a position higher on the mountain. They knew the path existed. They did not know exactly when or where an enemy column might appear. Herodotus says the Persians climbed without being noticed until the noise of leaves announced them. The Phocians rose quickly and armed themselves. Hydaspes was surprised to find troops ahead. For a moment, he feared they might be Spartans sent to block the route. Ephialtes identified them. The Persians released a dense shower of arrows. The Phocians withdrew toward higher ground, believing they were the target of the attack and preparing to defend themselves there. Hydaspes did not follow. His purpose was not to destroy the mounting guard. It was to reach the road behind Leonidas. The Persian column continued along the path and began its descent. Below them, The second day of battle had ended. Men at the wall rested beside the same position they had held since the first assault. From the Persian camp to the north, fires looked no different from the night before. The danger was no longer in front of them. It was moving through the darkness above. The first warning came before dawn. A seer named Megistias examined the animals offered in sacrifice and declared that death would arrive with the morning. In the Greek world, commanders did not separate military decisions from signs, ritual, and divine favor. Sacrifice before battle was part of understanding whether action was permitted and what kind of future awaited. Megistias had remained at Thermopylae as an advisor. Herodotus says Leonidas later urged him to leave, but he refused. He sent his only son away and chose to stay himself. The prophecy was soon joined by practical evidence. Deserters came into the camp reporting that Persian troops had crossed the mountain. Then the day guards arrived from the heights. 3 different warnings carried the same message. The pass had been turned. The Greek commanders gathered while darkness was fading. Their choices were limited, but not simple. They could abandon the position immediately and attempt to keep the whole army together. They could divide, leaving a rear guard while the rest withdrew. Or they could remain in full strength and risk encirclement before the road south closed. Herodotus preserves disagreement about what happened next. Some Greeks wanted to leave. Others wished to hold the post. He says part of the army departed, while Leonidas and those prepared to remain stayed behind. He also offers 2 explanations. One was that Leonidas ordered the allies away because he wished to save them. The other was that their courage had failed and he dismissed men who no longer wished to share the danger. Both may contain part of the truth. An allied army is rarely moved by one emotion. Some commanders may have obeyed a deliberate regard plan. Some may have believed the position no longer served a purpose. Some may have wanted to survive. Others may have felt shame at leaving. Leonidas could not preserve the pass. Highdarns would soon be behind him. Xerxes could attack from the north at the same time. Remaining meant almost certain destruction. Yet a rapid withdrawal by thousands of men through limited roads was also dangerous. A rear guard could keep the Persian front occupied and give the others time to move south. The oracle about a Spartan king may have returned to Leonidas' thoughts. So may the expectations of the city that sent him. Herodotus believed fame and the safety of Sparta shaped the choice. We cannot enter the king's mind. We can see the decision. Leonidas remained. The 300 Spartans remained with their king. They had been selected as men with living sons. If that choice was meant to preserve their households, it also acknowledged the possibility that none would return. The 700 Thespians remained as well. Their commander was Demophilus. Their city had no Spartan law requiring them to die beside Leonidas. Herodotus says they stayed willingly and refused to abandon him. That decision deserves to stand beside the courage of the 300. Thespiae was a small Boeotian city living in the shadow of larger neighbors. Its men had joined the alliance when other communities in the region leaned toward Persia. They had defended the pass for 2 days and now faced the destruction of a large part of their citizen force. The 400 Thespians also remained. Herodotus says Leonidas kept them as hostages and that they stayed unwillingly. Later, during the final fighting, some attempted to surrender. Yet the ban politics were divided, and scholars have long questioned whether the entire group can be understood through a single accusation of disloyalty. Some may have been compelled. Some may have supported resistance. Some may simply have been trapped by the decisions of commanders. The uncertainty should remain visible. War does not always leave motives arranged clearly around the dead. Helot attendants and other unnamed men were also present. Their number and fate are not recorded with the care given to Spartan citizens. The final force was therefore larger than the famous 300, but smaller than the army that had held the pass on the first 2 days. Those leaving moved south while there was still time. They carried news that Thermopylae had been lost and that Leonidas remained behind. The road would have been crowded with tired men, wounded companions, weapons, and the uneasy knowledge that every step away increased the distance between them and those staying. Megistias sent his son with the departing troops. The father remained. 2 Spartans had been suffering from a severe eye illness. Leonidas allowed both to leave the line. One, Eurytus, ordered a helot attendant to guide him back to the battle when he heard what was happening. Nearly blind, he entered the final fight and was killed. The other, Aristodemus, survived. His survival would later become a punishment of its own. Before that judgment came, the last defenders prepared for mourning. They did not wait only behind the repaired wall. Leonidas chose to advance toward the wider part of the pass, where his remaining men could fight with fewer restrictions and inflict as much damage as possible before the encirclement closed. The purpose of the battle had changed. They were no longer holding Thermopylae until reinforcements arrived. They were buying the final hours of a retreat. Dawn reached the pass slowly between mountain and sea. The defenders ate what food remained. They adjusted armor and gathered weapons. Broken spears from the previous days could be replaced only while supplies lasted. The wounded who remained beside them knew there would be no protected road home. Xerxes did not attack at the first light. Herodotus says he waited until the hour when the marketplace would normally fill. The delay gave Hydarnes time to descend from the mountain and approach the rear of the Greek position. For Leonidas, each moment carried the sound of 2 armies. Persian troops gathered to the north. Somewhere behind the pass, the column from the mountain was drawing closer. The remaining Greeks moved forward. This final advance took them beyond the narrowest defensive ground and into a wider space. It allowed more men to fight, but it also exposed them to the size of the force ahead. They fought with the knowledge that retreat was ending. Herodotus says they displayed a fury greater than before. Persian officers drove units forward. Men were forced into the struggle by those behind them. Some fell into the sea. Others were crushed in the crowded approach. The language of the ancient account is vivid and hostile. It was written from the Greek side and shaped by the memory of victory in the wider war. Persian courage appears less often than Persian numbers. But the men advancing into the pass were also facing terror. They had seen earlier attacks fail. They knew the defenders expected death. They entered a space filled with broken equipment and the bodies of those who had gone before them. The last battle was not a simple contest between brave men and unwilling masses. It was a collision of commands, loyalties, fear, discipline, and physical pressure on both sides. Greek spears began to break. Men drew swords and fought at closer range. The large shields that had formed a wall became individual pieces of protection in a battle losing its order. Leonidas was among the Spartans at the front. He was not a distant commander watching from safety. Spartan kings were expected to lead armies in person, and Leonidas had chosen the ground on which he would share the fate of his men. During the fighting, he fell. Herodotus calls his death brave but gives no final speech and no perfect cinematic moment. The king disappeared into the violence of the line. His death did not end the struggle. It created a new one. The Greeks and Persians fought over his body. For times, Herodotus says, the Greeks drove the Persians back from the body of Leonidas. The struggle was about more than recovery. To lose a king's body was to allow the enemy to strip, display, or dishonor it. To carry him away was to preserve a final bond between commander and army. Around Leonidas fell prominent Persian soldiers as well, including 2 brothers of Xerxes. The royal family was not watching the battle from a world untouched by danger. Men connected to the great king entered the same confined ground and died there. At last, warning came that Hydarnes was close. The surviving defenders withdrew behind the Phocian wall and gathered on a small hill within the pass. The exact shape of the ground has changed over time, but the final position offered no road out. The bands, according to Herodotus, separated from the others and approached the Persians with hands raised, declaring that they had favored the king and had remained only under compulsion. Some were killed before their intention was understood. The rest were marked and taken prisoner. The account may reflect later hostility toward Thebes as much as events in the confusion of battle. We cannot recover each man's choice. The Spartans and Thespians continued to resist. Their spears were gone or broken. They fought with swords, and when weapons failed, Herodotus says they used hands and teeth. The description moves from military order toward the language of total desperation. The Persians no longer needed to close with them. Missiles could finish the battle. Arrows and other weapons fell onto the hill from every side. The defenders disappeared beneath them until movement ended. By the time the sun was high, the road through Thermopylae belonged to Xerxes. The Persian army had won. Leonidas was dead. Demophilus and the Thespians had been destroyed beside him. Nearly all the remaining Spartans were gone. The repaired wall had failed, not at the front, but because the mountain road made the wall irrelevant. Xerxes walked among the consequences of 3 days of fighting. Herodotus says the king ordered the head of Leonidas removed and the body displayed on a stake. The historian considered this treatment unusual for Persians and interpreted it as proof of Xerxes' anger toward the man who had resisted him. We cannot know every motive behind the command. But the body of Leonidas had become important even to the enemy. The king who had blocked the road in life was turned into a warning after death. The warning did not endure in the form Xerxes intended. The body would eventually be remembered not as the sign of Persian victory, but as the center of a Greek legend. The victory opened the road into central Greece. Persian forces moved through Phocis and Boeotia. Towns and sanctuaries were burned. Communities that had resisted fled where they could. Athens was evacuated, and the city was later captured and set on fire. Thermopylae had not stopped the invasion. It had not destroyed the Persian army, and it had not by itself saved the Greek alliance. The battle must not be given achievements that belong to later decisions at sea and on land. At Artemisium, the Greek fleet had fought the Persian navy during the same days. When news came that Thermopylae had fallen, the ships withdrew south. The next decisive moment came near the island of Salamis. There, Themistocles helped draw the Persian fleet into restricted waters where its size became difficult to use. Greek triremes attacked in the narrow straits. The Persian navy suffered a major defeat, and Xerxes eventually returned to Asia, leaving a powerful army under Mardonius to continue the campaign. The war did not end until the following year. At Plataea, a large allied Greek army defeated Mardonius. At roughly the same time, Greek forces attacked Persian positions at Mycale across the Aegean. Those victories ended the immediate invasion. Thermopylae belonged to the beginning of that sequence, not its conclusion. Its practical effect remains debated. The defense delayed Xerxes for days and allowed much of the Greek force to withdraw after the mountain path was lost. It also demonstrated that Persian frontal attacks could be resisted on favorable ground. But the Persian army still advanced, and the final outcome depended far more directly on Salamis, Plataea, continued cooperation, and Persian logistical difficulties. The deeper importance of Thermopylae grew through memory. A military defeat offered the alliance a story it could use. The Greeks had been divided, frightened, and often uncertain. Some cities had submitted. Others had sent too little help. At Thermopylae, memory could focus instead on a king who remained at his post and allies who accepted death beside him. The story transformed weakness into a moral victory. That transformation began early. Poets wrote inscriptions for the dead. A stone lion honored Leonidas. The most famous epitaph addressed the traveler passing through the narrow road. "Stranger, tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their laws." The words are quiet. They do not describe how many enemies were killed. They do not claim that the battle was won. They reduce the story to duty, place, and the message carried home by someone still alive. Not every Spartan at Thermopylae died. Aristodemus returned to Sparta after the eye illness that had kept him from the final battle. Another sick man, Eurytus, had gone back to die. That comparison shaped the way Aristodemus was received. He was called a coward. People avoided him. No one would give him fire or speak to him normally. In a society where honor depended on public judgment, survival became a kind of social death. A year later, Aristodemus fought at Plataea. Herodotus says he displayed extraordinary courage, but also suggests that he fought recklessly because he wanted to escape his shame. The Spartans did not award him the highest honor after the battle, because disciplined courage mattered more than a private desire for death. His story complicates the simple command to stand and die. The culture that made the 300 capable of remaining also made survival almost unbearable for a man judged to have left them. Courage was not merely personal. It was enforced by memory, reputation, and exclusion. The Thespians paid a different price. Their city was destroyed during the Persian advance. The men who died with Demophilus represented a severe loss for a small community. Yet popular versions of Thermopylae often leave them at the edge of the frame. The same is true of the thousands who fought during the first 2 days, the Phocians on the mountain, the sailors at Artemisium, and the attendants whose names were not preserved. The phrase 300 Spartans is powerful because it is simple. History is not. Even Leonidas became many different figures over time. To some, he was the ideal king who sacrificed himself for his city. To others, he represented obedience to law. Modern nations have used him as a symbol of resistance, military brotherhood, nationalism, and political causes that have little connection to the world of 480 before the Common Era. Persia was simplified as well. Its immense and diverse empire became a background against which a small Greek force could appear heroic. Xerxes was turned into a tyrant without limits, and Persian soldiers into a faceless crowd. The surviving Greek account encourages some of that contrast, but a careful retelling must resist it. The Achaemenid Empire was one of the ancient world's most sophisticated states. Its soldiers came from communities with their own histories and reasons for service. Its ability to bring an army and fleet into Greece was a remarkable achievement even though the invasion ultimately failed. To recognize that does not diminish Leonidas. It makes the choice at Thermopylae more real. The defenders were not facing fantasy creatures or an incompetent enemy. They were facing the organized power of an empire. The pass itself outlived every army that crossed it. Sea and river slowly changed the land. The narrow shoreline widened. Roads were rebuilt. New battles were fought in the same region by Greeks, Gauls, Romans, and, many centuries later, modern armies. The hot springs continued to rise. The mountain still cast its shadow across the route. In Sparta, the remains believed to be those of Leonidas were eventually brought home and honored. By then, the king had moved beyond the private grief of Gorgo, his son, and the households of the 300. He belonged to public memory. Yet it is worth returning him to the final dawn before the statues and slogans. He was a king who had inherited the throne unexpectedly. He led an advance force that expected support. He held a pass with thousands of allies, not 300 men alone. When the position was turned, he chose to remain while much of the army withdrew. We cannot know every thought behind that choice. Duty mattered. Spartan law and reputation mattered. The Delphic prophecy may have mattered. The need to cover the retreat mattered. So did the simple fact that a commander could not ask other men to stay where he would not remain himself. Beside him stayed the Spartans he had selected. Beside them stayed Demophilus and 700 Thespians, men whose city had given them no promise of immortal fame. Megistias stayed after sending his son away. Eurytus returned though he could barely see. Others remained whose names were lost. Across from them stood soldiers drawn from the many lands of the Persian Empire, obeying their own commanders beneath the authority of Xerxes. For a few hours, all of those lives met on the same narrow road. The result was never in doubt once the mountain path had been crossed. The defenders could not hold both directions. Their weapons broke. Their formation contracted toward the final hill. By midday, the Persian army continued south. But history does not remember events only by their result. It remembers the questions they leave behind. What does a person owe to companions, to a city, or to a promise? When does courage become sacrifice, and when does sacrifice become a story shaped by those who survive? Why are some names carried forward while thousands of others disappear? Thermopylae cannot answer those questions for every age. It can only give us one summer morning, one king, one road, and a decision made while there was still time to leave. The fires have long gone out now. The shields have vanished. The armies are silent. Only the warm water continues to move beneath the mountain, as it did before Leonidas arrived and as it did after Xerxes passed through the gates. And somewhere in that quiet landscape, the old message remains. Remember those who stayed.